Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
My name is Paul Rozier. I'm the director of the Albert LePage Center for History in the Public Interest and a member of the Villanova Department of History. Welcome to this special event, a cross-campus collaboration between the LePage Center, the Department of Global Interdisciplinary Studies, and Russian Area Studies program, and a special guest to our distinguished guest, Lucy Minicozzi-Wheeland. A brief note about our format today. Dr. Chiji Akoma, the chair of the Department of Global Interdisciplinary Studies, who happens to be leaving or coming back, will introduce Lucy. And Dr. Mark Schrad, professor of political science and director of Russian Area Studies, will moderate the discussion that will follow Lucy's talk. Afterwards, please join us in the Driscoll foyer for a reception. Before I turn things over to Dr. Akoma, I first want to thank several people who helped to organize this event. Kevin Fox, where's Kevin? The brains behind the LePage Center. Joyce Harden in the back. Global Interdisciplinary Studies, and Dr. Mike Westrate, who's the Assistant Vice Provost of Graduate Research and Education, who unfortunately can't join us today, but thanks to all of you. Also, I'd like to encourage you to keep an eye out for more spring semester LePage Center events, which will include several virtual sessions on cities in historical perspective, a special event on baseball in historical perspective, one on Earth Day in historical perspective, and several informal and in-person lunch at LePage sessions on the 4th floor of St. Augustine Center. So please visit the LePage Center homepage for information about those events. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Akoma to tell you all about Lucy Minicozzi-Wheeland.
Thank you, Paul. Believe it or not, as Paul just started talking, I went looking for my notes in my pocket here. I didn't see it. So I had to start going out to look for it. And it was just on the floor there. So, yes. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome back to campus Miss Lucy Minicozzi-Wheeland, a Villanova alumna of the class of 2019, and one whose steady and distinguished progress in academics I have been very privileged to witness from close quarters. First, as our instructor, as the chair of the Department of Global Interdisciplinary Studies, GIS, and as an enthusiastic cheerleader all these years. Lucy majored in GIS, Russian Area Studies, and earned 2 minors in communication and ethics. She was the first student to major in Russian Area Studies at Villanova here, and the first recipient of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Medallion of Excellence in Russian Area Studies, the one named for Alexander Pushkin. She helped establish the Epsilon Nu chapter of Dobro Slovo, the National Slavic Honor Society, and she was both the secretary and acting treasurer of the Russian Club. She also worked as a Russian language tutor at the athletics department and at the Learner Studio, and served on the ethics program's diversity committee. Lucy won the prestigious Fulbright Research Grant for 2019-2020 and proceeded to Odessa, Ukraine. She also received critical language scholarship in Tbilisi, Georgia in the summer of 2022, and the Boring Fellowship also in Tbilisi for 2022 through 2023. Moreover, she spent much of 2022 working as a communications assistant at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and interned remotely as a news reporter at the Kiev Independent, the newspaper. Lucy is currently earning her master's degree in regional studies in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia at Harvard. She's also a research assistant at the Harvard Kennedy School's Intelligence Project, where her work focuses on Black Sea security and the maritime aspects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Additionally, she's an invited lecturer at Gori State University, which is located about an hour drive away from Tbilisi, Georgia's capital. It's also Tbilisi, Gori is also a very significant place because it's only 20 kilometers from the Russian occupied territory of South Ossetia. After teaching online at the university for the past 3 months, Lucy will spend this spring and summer semesters living in Gori and teaching an elective course on hybrid warfare for students in the public administration program. Ms. Minicozzi-Wheeland has spent a combined 19 months living in Ukraine and Georgia so far and has studied Russian, the language, for 10 years, Ukrainian for 5 years, and Georgian for about a year now. As a researcher, Lucy primarily studies Ukraine and Georgia with a focus on Russian warfare against both countries. She has spent these past years studying Russia's war in Ukraine, conducting significant graduate research on the subject, and working with NGOs, universities, and media outlets across Ukraine. She also has extensive experience in Georgia and has collaborated with NGOs there and with former and current government officials across the country. Lucy's master's thesis focuses on Georgian, I should get that right, Abkhazia, yes, Georgian, Abkhazia, and Georgian Ossetian peace-building dialogues and projects, conflict transformation, Russian warfare, and the human rights of those living in or alongside territory occupied by Russia. She also has initiated and carried out 2 Harvard oral history projects, which she will tell you more about during this talk. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming back this wildcat, Miss Lucy Minicozzi-Wheeland.
Thank you, everyone. I hope the mic is on. Thank you all so much for coming to hear me speak today. I really sincerely appreciate it. And I'll just pull this up. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So I want to start today by expressing my gratitude to a number of faculty and staff members at Villanova. So first, I want to thank Mike Westrate and Paul Rosier for the kind invitation, and the LePage Center, Global Interdisciplinary Studies, and Russian Area Studies programs for co-sponsoring this event today. I also want to thank Joyce Harden and Kevin Fox for helping to set everything up. There are many more people I want to thank at Villanova for always supporting me, like, once again, Mike Westrate and Catherine Stisek for helping me with nearly every fellowship, scholarship, grant, or graduate application I have ever submitted, with a 100% success rate on applications they helped me with. A little secret is that when I have applications to write, I don't go to the fellowships office at Harvard. I go to the Center for Research and Fellowships at Villanova, because the people who work there have knocked it out of the park every single time I've asked them for help. I also want to thank Boris Bricker for encouraging my passion for the Russian language and his birthplace of Ukraine, which ultimately started me on the journey to where I am today. I want to thank Dean Lindenmeyer as well for always being supportive of me, because the first time I ever thought I could get into a prestigious graduate school was in her office when she suggested I apply to Georgetown. And that moment really opened up my own understanding of what I might be capable of. I also want to thank, once again, Chi Giacomo and Lynn Hartnett for always encouraging my interests and for being so understanding when I was going through something difficult. And thank you to Father Loya for trusting me to help bring the Russian Area Studies major to life and to Emery Woodard for sparking my passion for the study of mass communication. As Chi-Ji explained, my name is Lucy, and I'm a master's student at Harvard, a research assistant at the Harvard Kennedy School, and an invited lecturer at Gori State University in Georgia. My master's program is technically 2 years long, but because I decided to complete several international scholarships and fellowships and write an entirely new master's thesis, I'm technically in my 4th year. Since I finished my classes at Harvard in May 2022, I spent a few months working remotely at the Kyiv Independent, and then, as Chi-Ji explained, I completed a critical language scholarship and a Boren fellowship in Georgia, which means I lived in Tbilisi for about a year. I'm only in the US for a few months because I'm going back to Georgia at the end of February, as Chi-Ji explained. I'll be teaching in person in Gori, which has come to hold a very special place in my heart, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to teach there. And Gori, as Chi-Ji mentioned once again, is a small city of around 40,000 people that is about 20 kilometers away from the boundary line with Russian-occupied South Ossetia. I'll be speaking more about that a little later. For now, the title of this talk is Interviews with Georgians and Ukrainians, a Villanova grad documents the impacts of Russian wars. In order to explain the projects that I have started and how I got to this point, I'm going to share some personal stories interwoven with the stories of people I've interviewed. And I do want to offer a quick warning that this can be a very heavy subject, so we're going to be talking about some difficult things today. It's a little emotional for me, and it may be emotional for you as well. And even though it may seem like from the outside, this is always what I intended to be doing, that's not really completely the case. It actually started fairly abruptly on February 24th, 2022, the day Russia invaded Ukraine. Like many people, including some of those who are listening today, I can divide my life into the time before Russia invaded and the time afterward. Before Russia invaded, I had spent 7 months living in Odessa, Ukraine, completing a Fulbright scholarship, and I absolutely loved it there. I had friends and colleagues who I became very close with, and I had slowly spent my Fulbright year becoming more and more passionate about Ukraine. I felt such a deep connection to the place that it's difficult to describe. I called Odessa, at the time, my home away from home. I had to return to the US very abruptly with the start of the pandemic in March 2020. The Fulbright office in Kyiv told us to evacuate, and I had just 2 or 3 days before the borders closed in Ukraine. And I was in Kyiv at the time. I had just arrived there, so getting to Odessa and back in just 2 days was next to impossible, but I managed to catch the last direct flight from Kyiv to New York City before the world shut down. I spent the following 2 years studying at Harvard, with 1 year online and 1 year in person, and I was constantly trying to get back to Ukraine. My original master's thesis was about why conflict broke out in Donetsk in 2014 and not in Kharkiv. This was made difficult because in 2021, my summer research trip to Ukraine was canceled due to the pandemic. However, I spent the summer and fall semesters working with the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and Chernobyl tours to get funding for a research project in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where I've visited twice, was supposed to go once again. A few months later, I received the grant that I applied for, and I was supposed to fly to Ukraine in early March 2022. I also applied for a Boren fellowship to live in Kharkiv for 10 months and finish my master's thesis properly, while working with professors at Kharkiv Karazin National University. Everything was going according to plan, but as we approached the date that I was supposed to leave to fly to Kyiv for my research project, the situation started to look more and more grim for Ukraine. On the evening of February 23rd, just hours before the invasion would start, the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard hired me to help manage communications during what was then being described as a crisis in Ukraine. I accepted the offer, and it ended up being a pivotal moment in my career, just as a pivotal moment in modern history was about to begin. Like everyone outside of Ukraine, I experienced the start of Russia's invasion via smartphone, and I messaged and called my friends frantically, and I couldn't stop watching the news. But that wasn't the reality for my friends and colleagues in Ukraine. When I would interview him a few days later, this is what an English teacher from Odessa told me about that first night. I probably won't forget waking up in the night to see the flashes seen across Odessa anytime soon, mistaking them for ordinary lights and then hearing the sound of rocket explosions is impossible to describe. Hearing them in person drastically changes your perspective, and seeing the light from them makes your heart rush like never before. The Ukrainian people have been prepared to withstand far worse than this for 8 years. The worst thing Russia has done so far is to make scary videos of Putin trying to look tough. Their bombs mean nothing to the strong men and women of Ukraine. Julia, an anthropologist, said the following on February 25th. I would have never imagined myself saying this, but I am grateful that my dearest father passed in 2020, and he isn't here to witness how his birth country, Russia, is outrageously attacking the place he called his motherland, Ukraine. These are just two examples of reactions that Ukrainians had on that first day, who I spoke with. Meanwhile, in the US, I had managed to get some sleep on that first night and woke up in a panic early in the morning and had another call with my best friend in Odessa. I spent the day checking in on everyone I knew, writing messages to all my friends and colleagues across Ukraine. I was desperate to know if they were alive and safe. It was through speaking to each of them and hearing their perspectives that I came up with the idea of collecting more official interviews from Ukrainians I knew and posting them on the Harvard website. I wanted people in the West to know what was happening to them. I felt as though it was essential for people to hear these personal stories and for them to be shared on a platform with as much reach as that of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Although I had been hired to help with communications and write news updates, I proposed the idea of these interviews to my boss, and she readily agreed. This is how the project Voices from Ukraine came to be. It ultimately came from a place of desperation to do something to help and a deep appreciation for the stories I was hearing from people that I knew. I think this is one of the essential things to remember, at least about my approach to oral history and interviewing. It has to come from a place of empathy and respect for the person that you're speaking with. It's not about you as the interviewer. It's not about some type of prestige or approval that you would, from other people that you will get by telling the stories of people who are affected by war. It's truly about listening to people's stories and sharing them in a way that they would want them to be shared and publishing them on a larger platform so that as many people as possible will see them. The overarching goal of this project that I had begun was to spread as much awareness as possible about the horror that Russia's invasion was inflicting, as well as the strength and resilience of the Ukrainian people at an individual level. And many of the stories I collected encapsulated both of these ideas. I want to talk about two stories that will always stay with me. Both of them were written by mothers of Ukrainian soldiers defending Mariupol during the siege of Azovstal. Their names are Irina and Vera. Irina's son, Dmitro, survived and returned home after being captured by Russian forces, while Vera's son, who she only refers to as her son or her dearest one in the story, was killed in Mariupol. I'll start with Irina's story. If you follow the news related to Russia's invasion closely, you may remember Dmitro Kozatsky, an Azov regiment soldier and photographer who posted an album of photos he took during the siege of Azovstal on Twitter before his unit surrendered and they were taken into Russian captivity. I became acquainted with Dmitro's mother, Irina, through a woman who was sending me the contact information of Ukrainians who wanted to be interviewed by foreign journalists. With Irina's permission, we posted Dmitro's photo gallery on the Voices from Ukraine page, and I was able to interview her. Here's an excerpt from her interview. When my son was at Azovstal, it became scarier and more infernal there every day, and there were many dead and wounded. Food ran out, and there was no drinking water. The soldiers gave their food to the women with children who also hid at the plant. There was never any reception. Every second, I waited for some good news from Dima. He always held up well and said that they were all good, but in fact, there was horror. It was incredibly difficult for them, but they are soldiers and have no right to surrender. The defenders of Azovstal and Dima were evacuated from the plant on May 17th through the 20th. It was an order of the president of Ukraine, save the lives of the military, because there were too many dead and severely wounded. When I learned about it and saw Dima in a Russian public group alive, I was happy beyond words. End quote. Dmytro was released from Russian captivity in late September 2022 as part of a prisoner exchange in which 215 Ukrainian POWs were traded for Viktor Medvedchuk, among others. That is the happy ending to one mother's story. However, that was not the reality for Vera and many other mothers. Here is some of Vera's story. I asked my son, "Did you manage to sleep?" Her son replied, "Well, no, Mom, it didn't work out. There is a lot of work to be done. I'll come home and get some sleep. I so deeply want to take a bath and get into a clean bed. We only have wet wipes here. I will show you photos of Mariupol. You will not recognize it." Then there was no connection. We were patiently waiting. Terrible news does not give peace. The city was surrounded. My beautiful son appeared on the line, finally. "What's up, Mom? What's the situation? Are they helping us? Will they unblock the city? Who has Volnovakha now?" "Son, there are battles in the north of Volnovakha. Our president speaks to all parliaments on all international platforms, asking them to close the sky, at least over Mariupol." My son was silent, obviously hoping to hear something more encouraging. "Mom, we will soon be fighting against the tanks with sticks. Of course, I have big plans for the future, but I want you to know that I don't regret anything." "Son, your birthday is March 25th. Maybe you will have time to win and come home to celebrate?" "Probably not, Mom." This conversation took place on March 18th. Again, no connection with our son. We waited, holding our breath. I text, I don't read. It gets a little easier, but in my mind, I always remember, my dearest is still there. We try to hold on. We wait for him to call. On March 25th, it was his birthday. He turned 28 years old. We congratulate our son in the chat. When there is a connection, he will read and rejoice. Please, I am writing letters with a request to unblock Mariupol and help the military on all social networks, foreign figures, bloggers, volunteers, all the time in the news. Maybe there is help for Mariupol. Hopefully, we are waiting. On April 7th, we receive a call from the regiment. Your son died. Pain, a lot of pain. I will not accept it. No, no, no. So many dreams, plans, hopes. He wanted to resign in January, but the commander asked him to stay a little longer. He wanted a family, children, and a civilian profession. He loved his country very much. Mariupol, Kyiv. He did not dream of living abroad. He only dreamed of traveling. Hope is alive. He will return. It is a mistake. Yesterday I learned that my sister is alive near Mariupol, but there is no connection, no food, no money. Thank God she is alive. We live in hope. One moment. That night, after I edited and submitted Vera's story, I was inconsolable. Whether it was healthy or not, I only felt better when I was doing something to help, even though it seemed so small in comparison to the sacrifices that Ukrainians were making every day. So, doing what I could, I completely devoted myself to that effort. In the few weeks that followed the start of Russia's invasion, I completely abandoned my work as a graduate student and began working at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard almost full-time, even though it was supposed to be a part-time job. I still attended class, but my homework and thesis seemed unimportant in comparison to the work I was doing on Voices from Ukraine. Even without going to Ukraine myself, the network of Ukrainians I knew grew and grew. Soon I was interviewing friends of their friends, and so on. As I mentioned earlier, I met a woman who was collecting the contact information of English-speaking Ukrainians who wanted to speak with foreign journalists. She frequently emailed me lists of Ukrainians who wanted to share their stories with me. This is how I ended up collecting a total of 36 interviews in the first 3 months of the war, which is the majority of the interviews on the Voices from Ukraine webpage. It's important to say that I have very minimal formal training in oral history. I've independently read textbooks and guides on oral history methodology, and I've attended workshops, but I've never taken a full class on this. My only prior experience with interviewing came from working on my original master's thesis, for which I conducted around 15 virtual interviews with Ukrainians from Kharkiv and Donetsk. So essentially, I'm primarily self-taught doing this. But through my original master's thesis that I never ended up finishing, I developed a passion for interviewing and knew it was by far my favorite part of the research process. I had also previously been deeply inspired by the work of Svetlana Alexievich, a Belarusian investigative journalist and oral historian who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2015. Her books entitled Voices from Chernobyl and Chernobyl Prayer were transformational for me, and I would describe her as my greatest creative inspiration. Her work is breathtaking, and I highly recommend it. All of this was to say that my idea for Voices from Ukraine was not entirely random, even though the creation of the project came from a place of desperation to do something, anything, to help my friends and colleagues in Ukraine. It was my way of bringing attention to what Russia was doing, even though it still didn't feel like enough. It helped that nearly all of my Voices from Ukraine interviews were conducted via WhatsApp Messenger or via email. I would make contact with the person I'd be interviewing, speak with them a bit about the project, get to know them a bit, and then send them a list of maybe 6 or 7 broad, open-ended questions to serve as prompts for their writing, essentially. I always assured my interview subjects that this was an opportunity to share their story, and they should only share what they feel comfortable with. They should not feel pressured to delve into topics that they don't want to discuss. They do not have to answer every question, and the interview can be as brief or as long as they want. Excuse me. I was able to accept stories in English. Excuse me. I was able to accept stories in English, Russian, or Ukrainian because of both my language skills and the tireless and crucial work of Eric Puzanov, an English teacher in Odessa who helped with the translation of the interviews. Eric is one of my closest friends, and we have collaborated on many projects over the years, so I want to take this opportunity to thank him once again, both for our friendship and for his contributions to everything he has helped me accomplish. Many of my projects wouldn't have been possible without him. Something that has also helped me, which may come across as unexpected for many of you, was my own experience seeing a therapist at least every week from the age of 13. Not everyone may know this, but I live with schizoaffective disorder. Schizoaffective disorder is a combination of schizophrenia and a mood disorder, such as depression or bipolar disorder. In my case, I have the bipolar type of schizoaffective disorder. For many years, I did everything I could to hide my mental illness, especially because of the stigma associated with psychosis and schizophrenia spectrum disorders. My condition had a very early onset, and I spent my adolescence and early adulthood struggling to cope with my often severe symptoms. I've tried every psychiatric medication you can possibly think of, and it wasn't until age 23, after 10 years of trial and error, that we found the combination of medications that has truly made my life possible, although I was still taking steps in my career along the way. My life was complicated once again by developing psychogenic non-epileptic seizures in 2022, which are essentially seizures caused by stress. This type of seizure occurs within the broader diagnosis of functional neurological disorder, which can have a variety of symptoms, including extreme fatigue, tremors, tics, chronic migraines, muscle twitching or jerking, and paralysis. I have personally struggled with a variety of symptoms related to the condition throughout my life, especially over the past year and a half. It has been a long process, but I can thankfully say that I have been seizure-free in the last few months. Although I was ashamed and hid my mental and neurological illnesses for many years, I have spent the last year speaking out about my experience more often in an effort to show people that you can still have an excellent career and a fulfilling life with chronic, mental, and physical illnesses, including severe and debilitating ones, such as a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. I have since been interviewed by American councils about my experience living abroad with chronic illnesses, and I gave a presentation to the incoming class of critical language scholarship students in Tbilisi about managing chronic illnesses while studying in Georgia, which has all been extremely fulfilling. It would be wrong to say that living with functional neurological disorder and schizoaffective disorder doesn't impact my work. I had to take months off from my internship at the Kyiv Independent because of the sudden onset of extreme mental fatigue, seizures, tics, and other symptoms in October 2022. Even now, it often feels like I have to put in double the effort to accomplish half the results on any given day. I also have to put more time and energy into managing stress because stress is a major trigger for both of my chronic illnesses. It may seem strange that someone who is so affected by stress would want or be able to work on topics related to war. It is definitely a challenge, and it involves a great deal of self-awareness and knowing when to take a step back. I would say that compartmentalizing is essential for this type of work. I can be in work mode for a certain period of time, and then it's essential to be able to turn that off in order to rest and recharge. All of that being said, living with these chronic illnesses has also strengthened my ability to work on difficult subjects. Although it is different from living through war, my struggles have given me an immense sense of empathy that is essential for conducting these types of interviews. The second you stop feeling empathy for the people you are interviewing, your work becomes more about serving yourself than the community you're engaging with, and your interview subjects will easily be able to tell. I want to share a story from someone I interviewed in Georgia as part of my current master's thesis. I'm not going to use her name, so I'll call her Nino. Nino is an IDP, or internally displaced person, from what is now called South Ossetia, and she now lives in an IDP camp in Serovani, about 30 minutes outside of Tbilisi. These IDPs live in simple houses that were constructed by the Georgian government after Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, and it has taken decades of time and effort, as well as money supplied by the residents themselves, to make their houses comfortable and livable. Nino works at an NGO founded and operated by IDPs in Serovani in order to make their community better and provide the people who live there with increased economic opportunities. Nino and her colleagues talked to me for about an hour, and then Nino offered to give me a tour of the camp. She explained that she does this a lot for tourists, which I found strange because it's an IDP camp. Why are tourists coming here? She explained that countless journalists and researchers have come here over the last 15 years, and the community has opened itself up to them. The residents have answered their questions, welcomed them into their homes, and ultimately gotten nothing back as a result of it. Journalists would come, saying they're going to write a book sharing all of their stories, and then never follow up with them about whether the book was ever published. This intrusion into their community for the sake of research has brought them nothing in return, nothing to help improve their lives, and as a result, the residents no longer want to be interviewed. The example I want to mention absolutely shocked me. Nino's friend brought a journalist from France who said he was going to write a book sharing the stories of everyone from the IDP camp. Nino was hesitant, but she trusted her friend and believed the journalist was sincere about his intentions. She invited him into her home in order to interview her grandmother. During the interview, as her grandmother described having to flee from her home in what is now known as South Ossetia, she became emotional and started to cry. Nino looked at the journalist interviewing her grandmother, and his facial expression hadn't changed at all. There was no emotion, no compassion, no empathy. And it was that day that Nino swore she would never bring another researcher or journalist into her home. This is a perfect example of why empathy and respect are essential for interviewing. In my experience, showing compassion and honoring the trust of the person you are speaking with are among the most important parts of oral history. Comforting someone when they become emotional and assuring them that they don't have to continue speaking about a subject if it becomes too difficult, giving them the opportunity to review the text of their story before it is published, and providing them with a link to the final product are all essential components of effective interviewing. Your job isn't over when the recording stops. It's still important to fulfill your obligations to the person you interviewed by providing them with the opportunity to review their work and see the final product. You want to treat the person you're interviewing like a human being and not just a resource for your research. Maybe this isn't the most squeaky clean academic methodology, but it's the way I've approached my work, and I'm proud of both the text I've produced and the relationships I've built along the way. Building lasting relationships is actually what I find most rewarding about my oral history projects and other professional endeavors. There is nothing quite like earning someone's trust, keeping your promises to that person, and creating a product that is just as meaningful to them as it is to you. What has been even more fulfilling, however, is not just building a relationship with one person, but becoming a trusted member of the community. I want to spend the next few minutes talking about Gori, a place that has become very special to me, but in order to do that, I need to explain how I ended up in Georgia. A few weeks into Russia's invasion, around March 2022, I realized that I had to hand in something resembling a master's thesis if I was going to graduate in May. I wrote a thesis about Ukraine that I was ultimately very unhappy with because it was essentially incomplete. I have never been to Kharkiv or Donetsk. I don't know what it's like there, and I only got to interview a few people online before Russia invaded. Although I never ended up finishing it, the project wasn't a total waste. It helped me discover my love for interviewing, and it gave me the opportunity to make new connections in Ukraine with people I'm still close to today. In April 2022, I found out that I had won the Boren Fellowship I applied for, during which I was supposed to spend 10 months living in Kharkiv working on my original thesis topic. I'm still in touch with the professors I was supposed to work with, and I talk to them often. I'm really grateful for all of them, as well as my friends and colleagues in other cities across Ukraine. I didn't think this presentation would be complete without talking about them and explain why I would make the decision to start writing a new master's thesis 3.5 years into my graduate program. The Boren office gave all of the finalists who applied to go to Ukraine the best opportunity it could to choose a new country where we could complete our Boren fellowships, no questions asked. Russia's invasion of Ukraine closed one door, the opportunity to live in Kharkiv, but it was also a new beginning because that was when I moved to Georgia. I immediately knew that Georgia was where I wanted to go because I had been thinking about applying to do my Boren Fellowship there anyway. However, it was completing a critical language scholarship in Tbilisi in the summer of 2022 that made the decision easy. I felt a tremendous pull toward Georgia, much in the same way that I was drawn to Ukraine. There are common threads between Ukraine and Georgia that made me fall in love with these places. It's mainly about the people and the culture. It is about the people's sense of community, hospitality, and kindness toward one another, devotion to their country, and a burning desire for independence and freedom from Russia's grasp. I told the Boren office that I wanted to change my country to Georgia, and that was that. I had to stick with my original Boren Fellowship language, which was Russian, and I decided to continue studying Ukrainian as well. I worked with several Tbilisi State University professors, Ilona, Irina, Nino, and Sofio, and I did my very best to study Russian, Ukrainian, and Georgian all at the same time, even though it was with mixed success. When I first moved to Tbilisi, I immediately started to develop an interest in Gori, even though I had never been there. I knew about Russia's occupation of Georgia to an extent, but I wanted to dive more deeply into that subject and look at how the occupation affects the everyday lives of those residing close to the boundary line. Gori was a perfect place to study that. I actually pitched the oral history project that I'm currently working on to Stephen Jones, the director of the Harvard Program on Georgian Studies, a little over a year ago, before I had even been to Gori. What I didn't necessarily expect was just how important Gori would become to me over the next 6 or 7 research trips. I want to take a moment to talk about Gori's history and Gori State University in particular. In 2008, Russian forces occupied Gori and the surrounding villages following its direct military confrontation with Georgia. After 2 weeks of bombardment and occupation, Russia withdrew to the region of South Ossetia as well as Abkhazia, which it still occupies today. The memories of this war and physical reminders, such as bullet holes in buildings, have profoundly impacted these communities. Being so close to the administrative boundary line also continues to cause problems for residents. For example, occupying forces have been slowly carrying their barbed wire fences further into Georgian territory during the night. This creeping advance is known as borderization. It leads to villages, farms, and schools becoming increasingly inaccessible and dangerous for locals who approach the fence, which sometimes divides their own property, at their own peril, lest they risk kidnapping and detention by Russian forces. Outside of Gori, even just an hour away in Tbilisi, people tell me, oh, Gori, that's where Stalin was born. But this town is so much more than that. I have come to love this place because of the strength, hospitality, and kindness of its people, even under the most dire of circumstances. I found another family in this community. It was actually because of my many visits to Gori and my growing connection to the city that I decided to completely abandon my old master's thesis and write a new one focused on Georgian, Ossetian, and Georgian Abkhaz dialogues and projects, especially at the Track 3 or grassroots level. In the last 6 or 7 months, I have conducted around 32 interviews for my master's thesis, and I'm well into the writing stage of the project. The faculty, staff, and students of Gori State University have been extremely helpful in completing the research for my master's thesis, and it would be wrong not to mention them in this presentation. As always, I'm grateful for their time, effort, and support. I'm looking forward to spending 6 months living in Gori, starting in just a few weeks. After I finish my thesis, I'll be able to focus completely on teaching my class in Gori and completing the online history project that I slowly started working on last year. Just last month, the Harvard program on Georgian Studies gave me a grant to help support me while I finished the project. I am sincerely grateful, and I'm looking forward to continuing my work and returning to Gori. The working title for this forthcoming oral history project is The Price of Independence, named after this mural in Gori, painted on a wall riddled with bullet holes. According to the interpretation told to me by Zhana Odiashvili, a Gori local and tour guide, the mural depicts a young girl and a man, presumably her father, standing beside each other beneath an apple tree. The apples are falling onto the opposite side of a barbed wire fence as the young girl and man gaze out onto the land they have been cut off from. This mural represents the pain of the occupation and the loss of having a part of your country, maybe even your family property, taken away from you. However, it also depicts hope. The young girl is holding a pair of scissors, which may one day be used to cut down the barbed wire fence. These same themes are reflected in the first 6 interviews I've collected for this project. 4 of the interview subjects are students at Gori State University, and 2 of them are students at Tbilisi State University. Unlike Voices from Ukraine, all of these interviews were conducted in person, and I spoke with a few other people in Gori that I didn't get the chance to fully interview. I spoke to one man who was the owner of a popular restaurant in Gori. I told him about my project, and I asked him if he knew anyone who might want to be interviewed. He told me he knew a few people who I could talk to, and I could interview him as well. What he said next hit me like a punch to the gut. He said that his parents lived in a village between Gori and Tskhinvali, and when Russia invaded in 2008, they bombed his parents' house, killing his father and burning the house to the ground. Russia almost destroyed me, he said. You can never fully prepare yourself to hear something like that, but it's something you learn to manage over time, being able to strike the right balance of empathy and professionalism. All of the students I have interviewed so far were 5 or 6 years old when Russia invaded, and they all have vivid memories of surviving the war as children. Here's what a few of them said. For Alexander, the war started at night. I saw the Russian artillery fire that night, and it looked like it was falling stars or shooting stars. And I was a child, so I could not imagine what was happening for real. And my mom just told me that it was not a good sign, and it meant that the war was starting. End quote. Meanwhile, as Russian forces approached Gori, Anna and her family fled to the village of Surami, which was safer than Gori itself. She said it was really hard to see military stuff in the narrow streets of Gori, as she recalls how people were trying to get help from us, and they were even telling us to take their child so they could be rescued. End quote. A particularly intense memory for Anna occurred just after the initial fighting had ended. Her relatives, who had been fighting in the Georgian military, came to Surami. Here's what she said. I remember how my father and my uncles were burying my uncle's uniform in the backyard, and everyone was crying, and I was holding my doll very tightly and watching this. They were burying his uniform because Georgian soldiers were still getting killed, even though the war had ended, and the enemy soldiers were returning to Russia. They were killing the people they came across. While some of my students returned home after a few days, others While some students returned home after a few days, others stayed in Tbilisi for much longer. Alexander, for example, lived in a shelter with other people who had fled their homes because of the war for several months. No beds were available, so they slept on blankets on the floor. Alexander described how they would all gather around the TV to get information about what was happening on the front lines. When Alexander and Anna returned to their homes in Gori, they both recalled the streets being empty with many signs of violence. Alexander described seeing destroyed houses, broken windows, burnt houses, marks of the bullets on the walls, and even in the central street, there were so many broken windows and signs of shells and artillery fire, and also the signs of tank tracks. So yeah, it really got into my mind and stayed there, and I can see it like it was yesterday in my mind. These are just a few fragments of what will be published on the Harvard website later this year once I've finished working on the project. After I interviewed the first 4 students who are pictured here, 2 of them took me out to lunch. Without me even noticing, one of them had paid for my bus ticket. At the kebab restaurant where we ate lunch, they refused to let me pay and covered the cost of my meal. I remember telling them that I was the one who should be paying for their food because they were helping me with my project. But they explained that they wanted to pay for my food because through this oral history project, by publishing their stories, I'm helping their community as well. In the past few years of interviewing Ukrainians and Georgians, with many of them directly contributing to my projects, I have never successfully gotten anyone to accept payment for their help, even though I've asked and offered countless times. I still struggle with that sometimes, why someone would want to help out just for the sake of helping. But this is the nature of my experience in Georgia and Ukraine. Both Ukrainian and Georgian kindness, hospitality, and caring prevail no matter the circumstances. And I think when you care, genuinely care about a community or a country or any population you're working with, that really shows, and it means a lot to the people you're working with. Genuine curiosity, caring, and passion are visible, and they will help you in your career perhaps more than any of your qualifications or experience. For that reason, if I have any advice for students today, it would be to pursue the interest that you're most passionate about and to let that guide you in everything you do. If you are genuinely passionate about something, other people can feel it, and that will open a lot of doors for you. I would also advise students to never lose their sense of wonder. Once you start achieving things, maybe small things, maybe big things, you can start to take it for granted and be annoyed at the little inconveniences that are inevitable with any work you're doing. Like being stressed about a long flight or never being able to stay somewhere for more than a few weeks or months at a time. But it's important to remember that sense of wonder and awe at the opportunities you get and the things you're able to accomplish. My biggest advice would be to never lose that. I want to wrap up this talk with one last story, and it's about my friend Mikhailo. I met Mikhailo while I was working on my original master's thesis, and I interviewed him in early February 2022, just before Russia invaded. We talked for an hour and a half, and I saved the recording of our conversation without thinking much of it. We stayed in touch over the following year, and I would frequently check to see how he and my other friends and colleagues were doing in Ukraine. He was devoted to public service and was very civically active, and a few months into the invasion, he told me that he had enlisted in the armed forces of Ukraine. Over the following year, we would talk about his experience in the military. At one point, he was in Kharkiv, another time in Bakhmut. He was the first to wish me a happy birthday and a happy new year. He sent me this photo on the screen now on New Year's Eve, the biggest holiday of the year in Ukraine. And this was the last photo of Mikhailo ever taken. He was killed in the line of duty, defending his country against Russian invaders in Luhansk Oblast not long before his 29th birthday. I found out that he had been killed via Facebook because so many of his friends were posting on his timeline. It was there that I saw a post from his mother, Nelia. I messaged her to offer my condolences, doing my best to communicate in Ukrainian, but it's hard to know what to say to a mother who has lost her son in any language. I told her that I was friends with Mikhailo and that I had interviewed him for an hour and a half the previous year, and we had stayed in touch. I wanted her to know the extent of his reach that he had friends on the other side of the planet. And when she asked, I sent her the recording of the interview with Mikhailo. A few days later, she told me when things become very difficult for her, she listens to the recording of the interview. She said that when she listens, he is alive. He's so smart, my boy. She said she is glad Misha had such good friends. Nelia and I have stayed in touch. She comments on nearly every one of my Facebook posts, and she sends me her best wishes on every holiday. I cannot imagine what she has gone through, but I am grateful that an interview, which I originally did for entirely academic reasons, brought her comfort during an unimaginably painful time. Ultimately, that's why we do this. That's the power of interviewing. When we collect stories, when we preserve people's perspectives, they can live forever. And that's the message I want to end this talk on. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have at this point, and thank you so much for your time.
So it looks like we have some microphones getting on. Should briefly introduce myself for a moment. My name is Mark Schrott. I'm the Director of Russian Area Studies and Professor of Political Science here at Villanova. I'm going to do a little bit of response to what I saw, but also a bit of moderation. So if you have questions and answers, we can get some of the microphones around, and which would be very useful since we are also streaming this event live as well. So, but thank you first and foremost to Lucy. It was a riveting presentation. I was deeply moved and affected, and not just by the story at the end. Much of what I see in Lucy's story reminds me of what I've been seeing a lot in sort of the area of Russian area studies since the invasion in February of 2022. Going recently to this International Slavic Conference in November, seeing people who have dedicated their entire lives to the study of Russia and Russian area studies now being completely disillusioned following the invasion. And so seeing that, people who have spent 30, 40 years studying Russia, having that same sort of tear, that the thing that I wanted to study is no longer the thing that it was. And seeing my own sense was that the people who are most happy in their research endeavors are people like Lucy, who have adjusted and are able to go to other areas and pursue their interests, whether that's Ukraine, whether that's Georgia. Other people have gone to Central Asia and whatnot. So very, very, sort of consistent with what I was seeing there. My other big takeaway from for the presentation, and this is something I did not know, I was very grateful that you shared your information about your condition, about being on the schizophrenia spectrum disorder. This is something that I have encountered in my own life, in terms of sort of my own background. I found out much later in life that I'm on the autism spectrum, and so it is one of those new challenges and sort of things that we look at, and to be at a place like Villanova here that values diversity in all of its forms, looking at racial, gender diversity, religious diversity, and on top of that now, neurological diversity as well, and neurodivergence, and looking at not just, people think about these things in terms of benefits and drawbacks, but not focusing on drawbacks, but looking at the actual genuine benefits and those things that you focus on, not just explicitly, but implicitly in your discussion about needing empathy and being able to share empathy and curiosity and being able to make those connections with people, and having that basic compassion is something that is really laudable and very, very moving to me as well. So I thank you so much for sharing that as well. So. At any rate, I do have a number of questions that I came up with, but I don't want to hog the discussion. I would love to field any questions that are out here for our esteemed guests. Lucy, are there any questions? We'll go back here.
Hi, my name is Declan. I'm a sophomore. One question I had was, I think over in the West, we've seen a lot of stuff about like the unity of Ukraine, and I was wondering if you could talk on just like the overall spirit of the country right now.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. Can everyone hear me with this mic? Okay, good. Yeah, I'm happy to speak about that. Thank you for your question. I have definitely seen in my experience with people I know and in terms of statistics as well, that there is an incredible unity in Ukraine, even far more than before the invasion. This is something that you can observe like almost immediately in statistics following the invasion, that suddenly the vast majority of the country wants to become a member of the EU, wants to become a member of NATO. That percentage skyrocketed right after the invasion, and it continues to stay high. I would say that the divisions between people who were, say, Russian-speaking before and Russian and Ukrainian-speaking have diminished as well, where there had previously been intentional policies implemented at the presidential level to try and make Ukrainian the one language of the country. And there was always that kind of Russian language pushback of people still wanting it to be, you know, a regional language that people could use in official documents. And that's something that was preserved. But what I've actually found, especially in places like Tbilisi, where I was, where a lot of Ukrainian refugees ended up, is that Ukrainians who spoke Russian before and didn't so much speak Ukrainian are now choosing to speak Ukrainian rather than Russian, specifically because they want to learn the official native language of the country where they live, and they don't want to continue speaking what they see as a colonial language, which is Russian. And that's the relationship. I would say that the thing that's ironic is that by invading, Putin perfectly united Ukraine. He perfectly made Russian-speaking Ukrainians often start speaking Ukrainian, and it's just completely the opposite of what he could have ever intended to accomplish with the invasion. So I hope that answers your question well.
Great, thank you. Other questions? I have some here in the back, yeah.
Hi, my name's Peggy. I'm a junior. I guess my question is, looking at sort of your experiences of speaking with people from Ukraine and from Georgia about their experiences of kind of Russian warfare and the cost of that, is there some sort of sense between the countries of some sort of a unity against Russia and sort of towards the West, or is it more internal unity? Yeah.
I think that's a great question. Thank you so much for asking. I will say definitely within both countries, there's a much greater unity as a result of Russia's actions and Russian violence. But I think the question's a little complicated following the invasion in 2022, where the people, the vast majority of Georgia, in Georgia it's particularly complicated, the people in Georgia are absolutely in solidarity with Ukraine, absolutely. It's something like high percentage, I think, is in the high 80s of people who want to become a member of NATO and a member of the EU. I think NATO is a little lower, maybe in the 70s, but still a huge increase as a result of, it was already high, but it was a huge increase as a result of the invasion. However, the difficulty, so I would say at the level of individual people, yes, there absolutely is that solidarity against Russian warfare in the sense that these are both countries, along with other countries in the region, that have suffered as a result of this. But I will say that for Ukrainians, it's a little complicated at this point because the Georgian government, the Georgian Dream administration, which is the ruling political party, is known for taking more of a policy of appeasement towards Russia rather than really pushing against them. And they have used, tactics like disinformation propaganda, trying to discredit the opposition, and trying to really, they say in name, we want to become a member of the EU, we want to become a member of NATO, we oppose Russia, and I would say the president actually truly is very pro-European, but in the Georgian government, the president has less power than the prime minister and the parliament, and the prime minister and the parliament are both much more geared towards that kind of appeasement. And for that reason, Georgia actually did not put sanctions on Russia following its invasion of Ukraine. And this is something that was very upsetting to a lot of Ukrainians and to the Ukrainian government. I believe they even made statements about this. The fact that, why, like Georgia, why wouldn't you put sanctions on Russia? But I think the reason is because of the vulnerability of Georgia. I think I can understand the logic of the ruling party that they just don't want to cause another war with Russia, because the difference between Georgia and Ukraine is that Ukraine is a country of 44 million people with an advanced military that was, even in 2022, was very much helped develop by the United States. They already had a lot of weaponry as a result of military aid, and they have put up one hell of a fight. Like, they're still going, they're still fighting, and this is something that Georgia simply would not be able to do. Georgia is a country of around 3 or 4 million people, and it's very small, and their military is also small. It's more developed than it was in 2008. But the reality is, as was told to me by a member of parliament, if Russia wanted to invade Georgia, Georgia would cease to exist in 3 days. That they would take the country so quickly and so easily. And I can even just say, I've gone on a long time, but one thing I would say briefly is that the purpose of Russia occupying South Ossetia is very much to emphasize that threat, that they could take Tbilisi in an hour if they wanted to. There's a main highway that cuts across the entire country because it's more of an east-west kind of, it's longer than it is tall. And there's one highway that goes across the whole country. And at one point, the territory of, so-called South Ossetia dips within a few hundred feet of the highway. And you can see Russian and occupying forces, their military installations in the side of the hill. So the idea of holding this territory, as much as they deny that they're doing it for this reason, is specifically to have a Russian military base in the middle of Georgia and to be able to just cut off that highway in 10 minutes if they wanted to and cut the country in half. So I answered more than just your initial question, but I feel like it's important to contextualize, if we're talking about Georgian and Ukrainian solidarity, why there's the policy in Georgia there's an inconsistency between the government and the people, and there's much more solidarity between the people of Georgia and Ukraine than the governments of Georgia and Ukraine. I hope that makes some sense, and why that would be the case.
Quite fascinating. So, we do have some other questions around here.
Hello, I'm John Valencia, Jr. And so my question is, when you were doing research and your current ongoing research for your new thesis, were you able to get more insight onto what your original thesis question was? What is the difference between Donetsk and Kharkiv, and why there was a difference in attitude towards the revolution in 2014?
That is a very interesting question, and it's hard to say just because the subject matter is so different. It's a different country. It's not even looking at the same kind of methodology where I'm comparing, there's another territory in Georgia called Ajaria, that was also autonomous during the Soviet period, and Abkhazia and South Ossetia both were as well. And in 2 of those cases, war within a few years broke out in opposition to the government in Tbilisi after independence, and it did not in Ajara. And I think that, it's hard to really say just because I'm working on something so different at this point. And I think a lot of good research is being done and has been done on my original thesis topic. And I'm more interested in, say, reading that type of research and kind of finding out from other people who actually have been able to get on the ground and interview people. Just because my original thesis was so limited in what I was able to accomplish from the research perspective, it really was just, it wasn't like I didn't want to do the project, it was just so incomplete because of the pandemic and then because of the invasion. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I feel like the best way I would be able to say it is not necessarily I got more insight. I think it's just the fact that the cases are so different. Even if I was focusing on the methodology, the cases are still quite different.
I guess just one follow-up. Do you know where I could look into to see who to read for this question?
Ooh, yes. So, oh my goodness. A really good book just came out. I'm completely blanking on the name of the author. I think it might be Dominique Arel. Arel. I think that is one of the authors of this book. I also don't know what it's called, but it was just published within the last couple of years, and it's specifically addressing that question of why Donetsk and not Kharkiv, and they have a really interesting argument that they make about the specifically being the agency of the pro-Russian groups in these cities, as essentially they used, they over a period of time, this is the argument of the book, that these, what called themselves pro-Russian groups would use these protests to say like, oh, we want to join Russia, oh, we don't want to be with Kyiv, in order to put pressure on the government and onto Kyiv in order to get concessions, rather than actually having any desire to be a part of Russia. The book argues that it was very much to the protesters in Donetsk's surprise in 2014 that Russia actually came in and backed them and took over. And in Kharkiv, as soon as it was clear that that had happened, as soon as they saw that, oh, Russia actually did come, they immediately stopped, and that ended the protests in Kharkiv. Again, I haven't read the full book, so that's my understanding of what was argued in the book, but I would definitely recommend looking into it if this is a subject that interests you.
I just did a quick Google. Is that Ukraine's Unnamed War? Is that the name of the book? The Dominique Arel book?
I don't know off the top of my head, but if you look at the abstract or the summary, it's I think it is one of Dominique Arel's books, perhaps even the newest one. So it very well could be that one. I just don't know off the top of my head.
This actually, what's interesting is dovetails very nicely with one of the questions that I had, and not to give too much of an advertisement for Villanova Political Science, but we do have also a master's program, and we have classes that I teach on Russian politics and Ukrainian politics. And one of my students last semester from Ukraine in the class here at Villanova did this wonderful research project. He's from Kherson region, which is currently on the border with sort of occupied areas and back and forth. And so he wanted to do a research project based upon oral histories of people that he knows across Ukraine, sort of gauging the severity of the Russian occupation. And so we had family in Kharkiv area, Donetsk area, Mariupol area, and Crimea as well. And so his suggestion, his hypothesis, which I want to bounce off you here, was that sort of the severity of the Russian occupation, at least as he saw it, was kind of proportional to the welcome, let's say, of the local communities, right? So Crimea, it seemed to be more sort of a light occupation, whereas the I guess maybe as the amount of opposition to Russia would grow, so too did the harshness of reprisals and what have you. And he wanted to ultimately extend that into looking at Russian occupation in South Ossetia and sort of Abkhazia. So I was curious if that hypothesis floats with you, or does it hold any water based upon what you've seen?
That is a really interesting idea and a really great project. And I would agree in the case of Ukraine that that's definitely something that we can see. I would say in the case of
South Ossetia and Abkhazia, it's a little more complicated, and I can get into that in a minute. But just to speak about Ukraine, I would say that that is consistent with what I knowledgeable about and what I know. Because there definitely is a really significant level of resistance in a lot of regions of Ukraine that are currently occupied with, I remember seeing videos of protesters with Ukrainian flags. I think even in Kherson this was happening while Kherson was occupied. So it doesn't surprise me at all that the occupying forces would want to respond to resistance with more repression and target individuals specifically who are contributing to that resistance. So to me, like off the top of my head, yeah, that totally makes sense. In Georgia, I would say it's a little different in the cases of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, because in both of those regions, I think in this context, I would look more at what the government's policies are, where both of these regions absolutely support having help from Russia. There isn't, to my understanding, a lot of resistance, at least from most of the population. I will say that there have been more conflicts that have been suppressed in Abkhazia, because there's a region that is occupied primarily by Georgians, and they're very disenfranchised because of the de facto administration not giving them the same rights as Abkhaz people who are living in Abkhazia. And that resistance has been crushed violently. In the past, there was a small war that broke out as a result of that resistance. But I also will say that in the case of South Ossetia, my understanding, I actually don't know enough about the kind of resistance that there has been apart from that conflict in Abkhazia. So it is difficult for me to say. But I will say, at least on the level of people who I have talked to and the people who have family or know people, especially in South Ossetia, the repression is significantly worse than in Abkhazia. Much worse in South Ossetia. And part of this is because the de facto administrations in South Ossetia, there's a lot of Russians who are in the de facto administration, the sort of government that's in charge of South Ossetia, and they want to be annexed by Russia. And they have no desire to be independent, even though they might say it in name. And as a result of that, they are far more authoritarian than the de facto government in Abkhazia, whereas Abkhazia wants to be independent. And because of this, they allow things like a little bit of a civil society. They allow some like peace building dialogues with Georgians going on, whereas in South Ossetia, these dialogue projects that I'm studying in my master's thesis have to operate completely in secret with as much anonymity as possible for the participants, because it can be a safety risk. It can be, there's the risk of being ostracized from their communities, from their families, because the Russian propaganda and the level of fear, but also strong support of Russia and condemnation of the West and condemnation of Georgia is so intense that if they're, caught even really talking to a Georgian working on these issues, they can be totally ostracized or even get in trouble with the government. So in terms of the level of repression, I'm sure there is definitely a very authoritarian repressive response to any resistance in both regions, but off the top of my head, based on what I'm studying, it's much worse in South Ossetia. And I don't know if that's necessarily because there was more resistance in South Ossetia. I think it has more to do with the behavior and the way that the de facto government has run the territories, and also Russia's goals and influence in both of those regions. I don't know if that really answers the question, but that's just what comes to the top of my head.
Well, that's wonderful. I think it's a lot more nuanced to it here. We have time for another question or two if there are others here.
I have one. Lucy, what a profoundly intelligent and moving presentation. Thank you. You really make us proud. My question actually is about Russians. Russians living in Tbilisi, refugees from the war, anti-war, perhaps younger Russians or even Russians who have been working for Western countries and could no longer work in Russia, and so they came to Tbilisi. I had the privilege of being recently in Armenia, and there are Russians all over Yerevan. So I'm curious what you have observed about that expat Russian population in Tbilisi.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Adele. I really, really appreciate it. I have gotten to see this pretty close up, actually, because many of my friends, my close friends in Tbilisi, are Russian expats, and in their case, they left Russia under absolute threat for their lives. It is no joke. My friend he and his wife were married in Russia, and he had been conscripted previously into the Russian army and had served kind of in a desk role in a region of Moscow, and he wasn't in the military anymore. He did his service, he left, didn't support it, didn't want any part of it, just because it was mandatory, he did it. And because he had previous military experience, he was going to be one of the first people to get conscripted and go to Ukraine. So, and once you get that summons, you have to go, or you are under absolute legal threat, you are a criminal if you don't show up to the enlistment office once you get your summons. So the idea is people try to leave before they get their summons. So he got word from the enlistment office that his summons was coming the following day. And so he got in his car and drove to Georgia, just got in the car and left. And then his wife and another few of their friends have followed with them. They're all in Georgia now, working. So there absolutely is a threat to people's lives when we're talking about Russians who are leaving. I have other friends who, I have one friend who is a lesbian, and they're non-binary, and they also had to leave Russia. They left initially in opposition to the war, but now they are effectively a criminal because of Russia's laws related to gay propaganda and the LGBT extremist movement, as they call it, and as they have made it a criminal. I don't understand how the LGBT community can be a criminal organization, as if there's some kind of organized extremist movement. That's beside the point. But because of that, because they have posted online about being queer, about opposition to the war, they can never go back. They can never go back to Russia, at least until things change dramatically. And the experience that a lot of my friends have had is basically, how do we lose our passports? How do we get residence in another country? How do we get another passport so that we don't have to go back to Russia, so that we aren't under legal threat to pay taxes in Russia, because getting another passport means you can now go to other countries without having to do what they call a visa run, which is essentially where Russians can stay in Tbilisi for a year before they have to leave the country. So after a year, my friends literally just got in their car, drove to Armenia, went in one side, came out the other, and went all the way back to Tbilisi in one day just to get that stamp. They left the country. So there's all these hoops that my Russian friends and expats in Georgia have to kind of jump through in order just to exist and live there. There's also a great deal of opposition from the local population, perhaps understandably to an extent, because not every Russian that comes to Georgia as a result of the war is there because they don't support the war. Some of them do support the war, but they're going there because the taxes are cheaper or something like this. You do hear these other stories of people who ended up there just because of tax reasons, for example. And so there's definitely a resistance to both the people who were anti-war and people who were pro-war. There's just kind of this anti-Russian sentiment, especially because the country is partially, 20% of Georgia is occupied by Russia. So such a huge percentage of the country, when it's being occupied by a neighboring country that they see as a colonial threat, that they essentially occupied Georgia for hundreds of years, from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union. And when now all these Russians are coming to their country in huge numbers, and there's now hundreds of thousands of Russians in Georgia, there's more traffic than ever before, the cost of living has skyrocketed, nobody can get apartments because Russians are willing to pay top dollar for these apartments that landlords used to rent out more cheaply, so that students from more rural parts of Georgia could come and study at universities, because all of the dorms in Tbilisi are currently occupied by refugees as well. That they already were completely kind of full to the max of the amount of people that could come, and then that number skyrockets so much more. And there's definitely a resistance to using the Russian language, something that I have found, not so much with myself, but with my friends. There's this song and dance you kind of have to do in Georgia to identify what language the person you're communicating with speaks and how to approach that. And you always start with like, Gamrajoba, which is hello in Georgian. And then you say, do you speak English? And if they say no, then you say, Вы говорите по-русски, and then that's okay. And then you can switch to Russian because you've tried Georgian, you don't know Georgian, and then you showed them that you can do English, and if they can't do English, then it's okay to speak Russian. Because at that point, it becomes a matter of communication and not so much about, like, if you go up to a Georgian person and you just start speaking Russian to them, they can sometimes get angry, they can sometimes just pretend they don't understand you, and my friends have even been yelled at by, like, clerks in stores because they came up and spoke Russian to them immediately. So there's a very significant anti-Russian resistance in Georgia, including to expats who came who are anti-war. And I think as a result of that, many Russians are actually leaving kind of at the first opportunity they get to go to another country. For example, my friend just got a special residency in France on a special visa called Artists in Exile, is my understanding of what the visa is called. So a lot of people are saving up to go to Argentina because in Argentina, after I think 2 years of permanent residence, you are eligible for an Argentinian passport. So a lot of Russians are going to Argentina and ending up in the EU, but it involves a lot of elaborate jumping from country to country, get residence here because it's easier, get a passport, and up here, then you can get a better job in the EU. You don't have to work for a Russian company anymore because it's just a nightmare. It's a nightmare for them trying to find jobs, trying to find places to live, avoiding at all costs ever having to go back to Russia. So it's a really complicated situation. I've gone on and on and on about it, but I hope that answers your questions.
It does.
This is excellent, excellent. We have time, I guess, for one quick question, if anybody has one.
I have a very quick question,
Yes.
but can you hear me?
Do you need a behind you? Yep.
Okay. Okay, the question is very quick, but I'm really very excited to be here now, and I just came from my class. I had taught Lucy for 3 years, a lot of courses, so I'm very, very proud of you, Lucy, of your presentation and your research work and everything. The question is very simple, and it's kind of continuation of Dr. Linda Meyer's question. Did you observe any interaction between Russian refugees and Ukrainian refugees, real refugees, in Georgia?
a very interesting question. So in my immediate circle of friends, no. But I can tell you something I did see on places where people were looking for apartments, or people were posting saying they were looking for a nanny, they were looking to hire someone. And a lot of the time, if it's a Georgian, not a lot of the time, but sometimes if it's a Georgian person posting the ad, you might see the text at the bottom, no Russians. So especially Ukrainians might say, if it's a Ukrainian couple looking for a nanny, they specifically say it's not just that they don't want someone who's Russian, they don't want someone speaking Russian to their child. They're only okay if if they speak Ukrainian, English, Georgian, and so on, but they absolutely do not want someone who is a Russian-speaking nanny even interacting with their child in Russian. So I think there is a very significant level of resistance for Ukrainians, perhaps understandably, to people who are from Russia who speak Russian, because I can understand why there's just this absolute level of resistance that the perspective I've heard a lot from some Ukrainians is that Russians shouldn't be fleeing Russia. They should be protesting in Red Square if they don't support the war. Why are they here? They should be changing their country. Why are they allowing this war to happen? They kind of say they're complicit in it because they're not on the street protesting. Of course, there's complicated reasons why that wouldn't work necessarily. For example, 1 in 20 people in Russian is a cop. The absolute even ability for people to show up and protest and have it be anything other than violently suppressed is very difficult. But that's not to say all Ukrainians feel this way. It's just kind of patterns I've observed where, for example, I have Ukrainian friends who get along perfectly well with my Russian friends because they know, the way my friend Eric put it was that they're not Russian anymore. They left. They're not Russian anymore. They're not part of this anymore. They don't support the war. They're not complicit in it. Whereas other friends I have say, they should be protesting on Red Square. Why did they leave? Why did they leave the country if everyone showed up, of the millions of people who left, if they all just showed up on Red Square at the same time, they could overthrow the government. So there's both. I've seen kind of both that resistance and that acceptance where people are being like, okay, you're not guilty in this because you left the country, you're not paying taxes there, you don't support it anymore. So I hope that answered your question.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so very much for some wonderful insights and some excellent questions from the group. I do want to thank again on behalf of Russian Area Studies. I want to thank Global Interdisciplinary Studies and the LePage Center for also co-sponsoring this event. I'd like to welcome everyone. We're going to have a little reception out in the foyer afterwards. But before we do, please join me in thanking once again Lucy for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much.